I have an Olympus OM F.Zuiko Auto-S 50mm 1.8 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. This lens is not too hard to take apart, but it's not as repairable as some other ones, especially a few things like the how the diaphragm is set up. It's actually completely coupled to all the mechanical parts. So unless you take apart the diaphragm, which I did not attempt in this disassembly, it's a little bit more difficult to clean because you have to watch out that you don't hit any of the mechanical parts as well and damage those. And some other things, just the way it's set up, you can see that the aperture control ring is up. Here, is up on the top of the lens, and just how that's actually getting coupled, and then how all these things on the back, the signaler or where the aperture is, and then the stop down lever over here, how those are getting coupled in. It's a little more complex than some other lenses, and I just feel like more can go wrong during the reassembly. So what I'm going to be doing is fully disassembling this lens, taking off all the body sections, getting access to the diaphragm and the mechanical parts, so that pretty much the entire thing can be repaired. And I'll talk about a few areas where you can skip past some of the disassembly steps, but overall I'll try to disassemble as much as possible. So to start off, I'm going to go in from the front of the lens, and this is actually where the aperture control ring is. So I'm going to get off the aperture control ring and get access to the diaphragm on the front of the lens. So first I have to remove this name ring here with the Olympus name. And there are two little slots for a spanning wrench, but it'll only work with the pointed tip sort of spanning wrench. And usually you can actually use a small screwdriver or something, if you don't have one of those, to actually undo this ring by just grabbing the side there and loosening this up. So I'll undo this ring. And now I can lift off this next ring, which is what the filters actually screw into. So it just is loosely in there. And then there's another ring under that, this silver ring, which I'll also lift off. It's again also loosely in there. And this is actually what has the grooves for when you move the aperture ring back and forth, it clicks. These are the grooves over here that it clicks against. And here on this next ring, which is the aperture control ring, actually, is the little ball bearing that actually moves along those grooves. As the aperture control ring moves, this piece is held stationary and it moves along those grooves, making the clicking sound. I'll also lift off the aperture control ring. Again, this is just held in there loosely. There's a little ball bearing over here, but it's generally in there pretty tightly, so I haven't been able to remove it. And now I have access to the focusing ring down here and the front optics as well. So to get access to the diaphragm, what I want to do is remove this front optical piece. And it also has two little indentations on either side, so you can use a pointed tip spanning wrench on. And again, if you don't have one of these, you can probably get away with using a small screwdriver or some similar tool to actually unscrew this piece. So now I'll use the spanning wrench to undo the front optics and remove this. It's kind of a saucer shaped piece with the edging and optics on there. Now you can actually see the diaphragm itself. Let me put this on a camera mount so you can see a little bit better with the aperture control. So the diaphragm itself is in the center here, and then all the mechanical couplings in different parts are on the edge, so they're on top of the diaphragm going around. And this is all one piece. When I remove this later, you can see that it's all just one large piece that's doing all the coupling into the lens. So now to continue on the disassembly, I have to go in from the back of the lens and start removing some of these back sections as well. For this particular lens, I want to remove the mounting plate first. There's no grooves on this section here, the back optics, to actually remove it on its own easily. So I have to remove the mounting plate, which is held in place by these three screws on the silver section to actually get access to the back optics and the back of the diaphragm. So I can lift off the mounting plate here. It just lifts up and it had the levers sticking up, the two levers on this side. I'll set the main lens body aside for a moment. And on this back piece, if your lens is having any mechanical problems, this is one piece that's actually coupling the back sections of the lens, which has the stop down lever and then the aperture indicator, into the front of the lens. So it's going up through this section over here with these two levers on the inside. And I'll talk more about these on the reassembly. But there is one more piece that we can remove. And unless you're having actual mechanical problems, I would recommend against removing this piece because it's just a little bit annoying to put back in place. And that's this black ring here, which is holding on another set of rings. So I'll undo this black ring and then remove it from the lens. And you can see that when I remove that black ring, there's this second black ring that's under it that sits, let me get this back in position a little, it sits like this down in the mounting plate and moves back and forth. And there's a little spring over on this side that just came out, but I'll remove both this spring and this black ring and set those aside for now. Like I said, removing those is completely optional. The only reason you'd really want to do that is if there were mechanical problems with the back of the lens and for some reason it was not working properly back here. Continuing on with the main lens body again, I've now exposed the back section of the optics and you can actually just unscrew this by grabbing the middle and unscrewing the back of the optics, and this will expose both sides of the diaphragm now. So if I go in here and actually manually stop this down, I have access to the back side here and the front side over here. What I'm still wanting to do is remove the entire diaphragm mechanism from the lens so that it can be cleaned on its own. And on this lens, it has all the mechanical parts attached to it as well. So I'm going to have to remove those together. So flipping over the lens once more, on the front section here, you can see there are two important components. There's the focusing mechanism down here, then there's the actual diaphragm mechanism in here with all the mechanical parts. And the way that the aperture control is getting coupled into the intersection of this mechanical piece is through this little post on the outside here. It sticks through the slot and goes from the inside of the diaphragm to the outside and couples the two together. So it sets this post is controlling the limit of how far it can stop down. Here I'm holding the stop down lever and moving that post back and forth, and it's just controlling the aperture. So what I want to do is actually remove the inner part of this diaphragm with all the mechanical parts and the diaphragm itself from this component here. And to do that, I have to remove this post first. So it has a little slotted screw on there that I'll undo. And now I have to flip over the lens once again. Or actually I can remove this ring first, which was sitting on top of the mechanical parts. So that exposed a few more of the mechanical parts on this bottom section here. And I'm actually going to remove the entire thing by flipping over the lens. And on the back of the focusing mechanism, in this section, there are 3 little black screws going around here that I'll undo. And this is going to remove the diaphragm mechanism and all the mechanical parts from the lens body. So I undid those, and here is the back of the diaphragm mechanism. Each of those screws was going into a little kind of brass washer that just slides in place here. So there are 3 of those as well that I'll also just set aside for now. And now I have the diaphragm and all the mechanical parts on its own as well. As I mentioned, because the diaphragm and the mechanical parts, let me find where to stop this down. Because the diaphragm and mechanical parts are a single piece, this is harder to clean than some other lenses. It's more convenient to remove this piece, but I would probably recommend, if it really needs to be cleaned well, you would undo this back plate here and just remove the individual blades rather than trying to clean around all these little mechanical sections on this piece. Finally, looking back at the main body section of the lens here, I'm going to remove the last external element, the focusing ring here, from the internal focusing mechanism. So on this lens, the way it's attached is if I slide over this rubber gripping ring a little bit, so I slide this up, I'll just remove it fully actually. It's attached, these two are attached by 5 little screws going around here, little slotted screws that hold these two together. So I'm just going to loosen these up, and then I'll be able to slide the focusing ring itself off the focusing mechanism. Alright, so now I can just slide these two apart and have this focusing ring here separate from the focusing mechanism there. So now I'm going to start on the reassembly of this lens, and the reassembly is a little bit more challenging just because there are a lot of pieces that have to get locked together, but it's not too bad overall. Just have to make sure that everything lines up properly so that it works, so that the lens works properly. I'll start by getting the diaphragm and the mechanical parts back into the lens. Looking at just the diaphragm mechanism for a moment, there are 2 parts that are important here. So there's the black ring here, so this crescent-shaped black piece that I can move back and forth, and then there's this silver ring over here. And the silver one is actually what directly controls the diaphragm. It's held all the way open in its default state. And the black ring is actually what limits how far you can open and close the diaphragm. So if it's like this, so as I have this pressed, as the black ring is all the way over, pressing on the silver ring doesn't do anything, but as I move the black ring back and I keep the silver ring pressed, now it starts to close. So the silver ring is actually, what is doing the main coupling, while the black ring is it's what's controlled by the aperture control mechanism. So with this piece, I'm going to flip it over now, and I need to get the 3 little washers back in their positions, these 3 brass washers that were attaching to the bottom side of this piece. So the ones that the screws were going into. So these 3 washers just sit in the little indentations here on this back section. And now you can see that this has a little bar on the back as well. I want to line this back section up so that the bar goes through the slot of the section over here. So with this, like holding the diaphragm mechanism upside down, I'll feed it up into the main lens body so that the screws align and the post goes up through the slot there. And I'll reattach these pieces using the 3 screws on the back section here. Next, I'll get this piece, which is actually what is coupling the aperture control ring into the diaphragm mechanism and all these mechanical pieces back onto the lens. So the way this needs to go, there are 2 things. There's the section here with the fork that's actually going into the mechanical part and coupling these 2 together. So it's going over this bar right here. So going through this slot here, actually not coupling to the bar. But the other thing that needs to get lined up is there's this curve inside here, which is actually the aperture control curve. And that is going to go so that it presses, so that this little post down here on the diaphragm mechanism presses back and forth on that and moves back and forth. I think there we go. And so it opens and closes that as it moves along the curve. And then the third thing is the little post here, which is coupling the this piece from the inside here to the outside with the aperture control mechanism. That needs to get lined up with the slot, let's see where it is, down here on the main lens body so that it can go through there. So I'll get this lined up by lining up the post here with a slot in the main lens body, and then move it around until the little post down here, the silver one, is in front of the curve. And so when it's all the way flat, this should be sliding. We should be able to slide this around and actually see this post move along that curve there. And what actually happened here is that the silver bar right here slid off of its post right there. So I need to get that lined back up. Okay, so that's lined up again. I'll get this set up. And to lock this in place, I'll find a little slot over here and get the post back in its position as well. So it just screws in place. Now I'll reattach the focusing mechanism, at least in a temporary position, so that it can be later zeroed back to infinity. So I'll take the focusing ring here, and I'm going to just focus this lens in slightly. And in this position, I'll slide this back over. And just lock this down at any position, currently using these 4 little or 5 little slotted screws. And later on, you can actually loosen this up and spin the focusing ring independently of the focusing mechanism, and then get it so that the lens is optically focused at infinity. And when the lens is optically focused at infinity, you can adjust the focusing ring so that it reads infinity as well. Alright, now I have to get the aperture control ring back on. And the aperture control ring, the way it's coupling into the diaphragm and the mechanical sections, on the inside here, there's a little fork that actually goes over the post right here and moves the post back and forth. So I want to line this up so that that fork goes over the post, and then it should just rest down on the focusing mechanism. When I spin this back and forth, I want to see that the metal parts in here are moving back and forth, and I can hold the stop down lever on the back and actually see the diaphragm move back and forth as well. So that looks good. Continuing on with the front reassembly, now I'll reinstall the ring here, which has the grooves for the clicking of the little ball bearing over here. And this ring has a little knob right here, notch right here, that in this top ring there's a little hole or gap that this slides into, and then the grooves go on top of the ball bearing like that, and it just sits in place. Next there's another black ring that also has a little notch right there that sits in the same ring, so just on top of that previous ring. And now I'll reinstall the optics for the lens. So this front optical piece, it just screws in place. And I'll lock this front piece down with the pointed spanning wrench. And finally, for the front, I'll reattach the focusing, or the name ring here. So it also just screws in place, and it actually attaches down into the diaphragm mechanism down below this. So that's what it's screwing into. So with the front reassembly complete, now I need to reassemble the back section as well. And I took apart the mounting plate, so that's going to be the first thing I have to put back together. This step was optional, but I'll talk about how the mounting plate is getting coupled back in and how it has to be reassembled. On the back section and the main lens body, there are 2 important parts. In the slot over here, there's this aperture control indicator, which is right here, this silver section. So as I move the aperture control ring back and forth, it moves back and forth. And then there's the actual stop down lever over here. So as I set this to be fully closed and I hit the stop down lever, the lens fully closes over here. And on the silver ring back here, the mounting plate, there's two parts to it. There's the actual mounting plate assembly with all the components in here. So it has a little post back here, and this is what's getting coupled into the aperture control indicator fork back there. And then there's the second part, which is the black metal section, which is going to sit down inside of the mounting plate, kind of like, let me get this kind of lined up, like this. And it has a second post on the back here, and this is actually what's going to be controlling the stop down lever. So this post back here is going to go into the stop down lever. And there's a little spring on this section in here, in the black ring, that is going to actually hold this open by default. So the spring here is going to get hooked onto the inner section of the mounting plate right here, and then on the mounting plate itself, there's a little section back here where it's also going to be hooked on. So I'll start by getting the spring hooked up onto the black ring. And now on the mounting plate, flipping it over, I want to position it so that the section that's sticking out, so that the little black section right here is going into the groove doesn't already have the other black little post on this side. So it's going to go like this and just sit down on the top of the mounting plate, and it should slide freely back and forth. But I have to get the little, I have to make sure that the spring is also attached when I do this. Okay, now just holding this in place on the back. I also want to hook the spring over here so that it's attached. Let me slide this post over. So it's attached into the little section right here. So I have to just gently maneuver this spring. All right, so holding that in place on the back, I can reattach this black plate so that the two little bars on either side go through the two gaps in this black plate, and reattach it with the three little black screws. I can check and make sure that everything's working. On the back here, it should, when I move the stop down lever here back and forth, it should move freely, and this other one should just rotate around on its own independently. So now, looking back at the back section of the lens, I'm going to reattach the back optical piece right here. It just screws in place in the middle. And I have to line these two up, so the mounting plate and the main lens, so that they fit together properly. What I want to happen is I need the longer post here to go into the fork down there, and I need this other one to actually go in front of this bar over here. So that as I open and close this, it should, as I hit this, it should allow this to open and close. So I want to line this up. I'm going to move this bar on the inside here, or the aperture control ring, so these are kind of in position of how I want it to be. And I'll get the longer bar in position first. And with that in position, I can kind of slide this around until hopefully it should couple. So it looks like I didn't get it that time. Okay, so what I want to see, I haven't locked this down yet, but is when I hit the stop down lever, the diaphragm or the aperture closes up, and when I move the aperture control ring back and forth, I can control that behavior. Now I'll just lock on this back mounting plate with the 3 screws going around there, there, and there. Alright, so that has the reassembly complete on this lens. Overall, the disassembly and reassembly aren't too difficult. There are a few kind of interesting features. Let me put on the rubber gripping ring here. There are a few kind of interesting features of this lens, such as the diaphragm and mechanical components being coupled together that do make repair more difficult than it really should be, and just how the aperture control ring on the front and everything's getting coupled to the back of the lens, and that whole setup is also a little bit more difficult than some other lenses. So reassembling that takes a little bit more work to get everything coupling together correctly, but not too bad overall. It is a repairable lens, just a few difficult parts.